same as taking hormones or bioidentical hormones, which indeed can shut down your own endogenous production of hormones and thereby reduce both egg quality and the chance of fertilization and healthy pregnancy, and sperm quality and the chance of fertilization and healthy pregnancy. Anytime there's a discussion about fertility and pregnancy, there seems to also be a parallel discussion about sex determination. That is, what factors can influence whether or not the child that's born is male or female. That is, whether or not it has double X chromosomes, so one X chromosome from mom, one X chromosome from dad, because the egg was fertilized by a sperm that had an X sex chromosome, that 23rd chromosome, or whether or not the offspring is male, whether or not it has the X chromosome from mom, because it's always going to be the X chromosome in that egg, and a Y chromosome from the sperm that fertilized that particular egg. Now, of course, there are instances out there of people that have XXY chromosomes or XYY chromosomes, but the vast majority of people out there are going to have either an XX chromosome, so we call that a female karyotype, right? This is different than genotype and phenotype, but a female karyotype would be XX, or a male karyotype, which would be XY, okay? Now, despite the fact that it is the egg and the sperm and the chromosomes that they carry that are going to determine the chromosomes, there's a lot of lore and discussion about the factors that can bias which sperm will fertilize the egg, and thereby whether or not you're going to get an XX, female, or an XY, male chromosome, and therefore offspring. Now, not only is the lore around this whole issue of sex determination rather prominent, but it is also somewhat unusual and perhaps even interesting. So, for instance, Aristotle himself proposed that if a man is thinking about himself and his own pleasure more than his partner and her pleasure at the point of ejaculation, then the offspring will be male. Aristotle also asserted that if a man is thinking more about his partner and her pleasure at the point in which he ejaculates, well, then the offspring would be female. Of course, we have zero reason to believe that there's any truth to Aristotle's theory. There are no data to support that. In fact, I'm not even sure how you would run that experiment, because you can't really look at people's thoughts. You'd have to rely on honest self-report. And even if people were to faithfully report what they were thinking about at the moment of ejaculation, this would involve, of course, bringing people into the laboratory and somehow measuring or analyzing their thoughts or gathering their thoughts during the sexual intercourse at the point of ejaculation, then figuring out which biological sex was the offspring, etc. Just near impossible, and probably not the most important experiment to invest our time doing. Nonetheless, there continues to be a lot of lore about what determines the sex of the offspring. Most notably, there's a lot of lore and discussion and rumor about the idea that particular sexual positions at the point of ejaculation during intercourse can somehow bias the likelihood that a pregnancy will be either resulting in male or female offspring. Now, again, there are zero data to support this, and yet this whole notion of sex determination is a really interesting one that people seem to be somewhat obsessed by. So much so that, again, if you go online or if you were to talk to people in the sort of, let's call it holistic or peripheral health spaces related to fertility, there is discussion about, okay, well, you take this sexual position at the point of ejaculation to get a boy, and you take that sexual position at the point of ejaculation to get a girl, or you do this in the early part of the day or the later part of the day. Again, all for which there is zero data to support any kind of systematic relationship between what I just discussed and the biological sex of the offspring. That said, there are now emerging methods that people are using in order to separate out the sperm that will indeed give rise to a male offspring versus a female offspring. Now, this, of course, is done in the context of in vitro fertilization. We haven't talked too much about in vitro fertilization, but in vitro fertilization involves, as the name suggests, taking an egg and taking a sperm, pairing them in a dish. This can be done a number of different ways, but just to briefly describe the IVF procedure, IVF involves administering supra, meaning greater than normal, supraphysiological levels of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone during the follicular phase of a woman's cycle. What that causes is the maturation of not just one egg that would be ovulated, but multiple follicles and eggs, and then ovulation itself is suppressed also through the administration of exogenous hormones. And then under ultrasound guidance, an OBGYN goes in and collects the mature eggs and follicles, puts them in a dish, and then sperm are delivered to that dish. And those could either be sperm that were frozen previously, or more typically, or ideally, it would be live sperm collected that day that are washed through a very straightforward procedure. And then those sperm either are allowed to compete for those eggs and fertilize those eggs and allow them to advance to very early embryo stage before those embryos are frozen and eventually implanted into a woman in order to have them be carried to full term, ideally. Or there's a procedure in which specific sperm are selected because they have the best morphology, motility, and so forth, and in a process called ICSI, ICSI, in which the sperm themselves are literally forced to fertilize that particular egg. Now, under those conditions, typically a couple or a woman, if she's doing this on her own with a sperm donor, will get multiple fertilized embryos, that are carried to a multicellular stage so that it's clear that they could grow into a child if they were implanted into a viable host, sometimes the surrogate, sometimes the woman who wants the child herself. And under those conditions, it is possible to look at the genetic makeup, including the karyotype of those early nascent embryos, in which case people really can select the sex of their offspring. That is, they will have some embryos that are XX, some embryos that are XY. It's very likely also that they will have some embryos that have karyotypes or genotypes which are not ideal, in that they would potentially lead to a miscarriage or some other genetic defect. And so typically people do not select to implant those embryos if they have the option to implant embryos that are of either XX or XY karyotype and the normal chromosomal arrangements for obvious reasons. So the whole point here is that sex selection is possible, but only using in vitro fertilization. The other thing that is becoming clear to us in more recent years is that sex selection is actually possible at the level of the sperm even prior to fertilization. This is an emerging data set, and this is largely happening in clinics outside of the United States, but there are some clinics that have figured out methods in which they can take a sperm sample and they can spin that sperm sample in a centrifuge at a rate that separates out the sperm into what are called different fractions. So for those of you who've done a little bit of biology with centrifuges, when you spin any kind of substance that includes multiple things in it of different weights, when you spin them, the things of different weights segregate out into different fractions along the depth of the tube. And then you can take out one fraction or the next simply with a little pipette. You take out the top fraction, the middle fraction, and so forth. And what these clinics have figured out is that if they spin the sperm sample at the correct spin rate, that the sperm that will give rise to male offspring and the sperm that will give rise to female offspring segregate out into different fractions, allowing them to take each of those fractions separately and to apply them to eggs, if it's in vitro fertilization, and give rise very reliably, certainly much more than chance, to either male or female embryos. They also, of course, can choose to do this outside the context of in vitro fertilization. So some people are now opting to have their sperm samples spun out in this way, separate out the sperm that give rise to male or female offspring, and then to only use the fraction that they are interested in, right? So if they want a boy, they'll use one fraction. If they want a girl, they'll use a different fraction. And then to use those fractions in the context of what's called IUI, or intrauterine insemination, which is, as the name suggests, rather than having the man deliver the ejaculate with his penis and the sperm with his penis, they have a device. You know, the devices are now commercially sold. Believe it or not, they're sold over the counter and on the internet, so people will even do this at home. And so what they're doing is they'll take the sperm and they'll do IUI in order to bias the probability that they're going to get a male or a female offspring. Again, this is something that's now emerging. It's not commonplace. Most of the time, people simply roll the dice, as it were, by having either intercourse and just hoping for or not caring if they get a male or female offspring, or in the instance of IVF, selecting male or female offspring, sometimes largely on the basis of the chromosomal arrangements. So, of course, some people might prefer to have one or the other biological sex as their offspring, but of course the healthy chromosomal arrangements are going to be paramount